The tarmac in Holborn is bubbling, not melting in some poetic, exaggerated way, actually bubbling, actually softening, actually losing its shape beneath the weight of London traffic, because the surface temperature down there has just touched 65 degrees Celsius, 149 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to burn skin in seconds, hot enough that road crews are being told to avoid certain junctions altogether, because the asphalt itself has stopped behaving like a solid. Somewhere above it, London hums along as if nothing unusual is happening. Buses idle, pigeons pant in the shade of scaffolding, and far below the surface of what feels like an ordinary summer day, something ancient and enormous is quietly rearranging itself. This is England in the summer of 2026, not the England of grey drizzle and apologetic sunshine, not the England of postcards, hedgerows glistening faintly with rain. This is an England that has begun, in its own understated way, to cook. And the strange thing, the thing that should stop us in our tracks, is that nobody who studies this land expected it to happen quite like this. Not this fast, not this far north, not in a country whose entire identity for centuries has been built on the idea that it simply does not get that hot. So what happened? What turned a nation famous for mild, forgiving weather into a landscape of scorched grass, evacuated hovercraft and closed schools? To understand that, we have to go back, not weeks, not months, but decades, into the quiet architecture of the atmosphere itself. Picture the jet stream as a river in the sky, a fast-moving current of air 5 to 7 miles above our heads that has spent millennia acting like a fence. On one side, the cold Arctic air. On the other, the warmer subtropical air drifting up from the south. For most of human history, that fence held its shape, wobbling gently with the seasons but never truly breaking down. Now ask yourself this. What happens to a fence when the land on either side of it stops being so different? The Arctic is warming nearly 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. That is not a guess, not an estimate pulled from a worried headline. It is one of the most consistent findings in modern climate science, repeated across decades of satellite data and ocean buoys and ice core records. And as the Arctic warms, the temperature difference that powers the jet stream, the very engine of that atmospheric river, begins to weaken. A weaker jet stream does not disappear. It does something almost more unsettling. It slows down. It begins to meander, looping and bending like a river, losing its urgency, carving lazy oxbows across the map of the northern hemisphere. And when it slows, weather systems that would once have swept through in a day or two now linger. They stall, they sit. This is what meteorologists mean when they talk about a blocked pattern. And in the spring and early summer of 2026, that pattern parked itself directly over the British Isles and stayed. Think about what that actually means for a piece of land that has never had to defend itself against heat. English soil, English rivers, English forests, they evolved under grey skies and soft, forgiving rain. There was no need for deep taproots reaching for hidden water tables, no need for waxy, heat-resistant leaves, no need for the kind of defensive architecture you find in a Mediterranean cork oak or a California chaparral shrub. England's ecosystems were built for gentleness, and gentleness, it turns out, does not prepare you for extremity. So in late May, when high pressure settled in and refused to leave, the land had no answer for it. On the 25th of May, the thermometer at Kew Gardens climbed to 34.8 degrees Celsius, breaking a record that had stood quietly since 1922. The following day, it broke again, reaching 35.1. Somewhere in that stretch of days, a 104-year-old number, a number set in the aftermath of the First World War, in a Britain of steam trains and horse-drawn carts, was erased in the space of 48 hours. There is something almost vertiginous about that. 104 years of English Mays, and none of them came close, until this one did, twice, in a row, and it did not stop there. Through the following weeks, as one heat event faded and another rolled in behind it like waves against a seawall, the records kept falling. By the 26th of June, a weather station in Lingwood, Norfolk recorded 37.7 degrees Celsius, a new high for the month of June in the United Kingdom, surpassing a mark that had stood since 1957, nearly 70 years gone in an afternoon. There is a particular kind of scientific unease that comes not from a single dramatic number, but from watching numbers fall again and again, each one supposedly rare, each one supposedly a once-in-a-generation event. and then watching the generation shrink to a season. What does it mean when the exception becomes the rhythm? Because this was not simply a hot day, it was a pattern with teeth. The UK Health Security Agency, the body tasked with protecting the public from exactly this kind of extremity, issued red heat health alerts across huge swathes of England. The East Midlands, London, the South East, the South West. Red alerts are not issued lightly. Before this summer, in the entire history of the warning system, they had been used only once, during the catastrophic heat of July 2022, when Britain first crossed the threshold of 40 degrees Celsius, and the word unprecedented briefly lost all meaning. Now it had happened again, not once in a decade, but twice within 4 years. Beneath the surface of that statistic sits something even harder to sit with. During the May heatwave alone, at least 19 people died in water-related incidents across the country, among them 13 children. Drawn perhaps to rivers and lakes and reservoirs by a heat their bodies had never learned to manage, by an instinct as old as the species itself, when the world grows unbearably hot, seek water. But English rivers were never built to be swum in casually by crowds fleeing a heat wave. Their currents run cold and strong beneath a deceptively still surface, hiding drop-offs and undertows that a desperate overheated body cannot anticipate. There is a terrible irony folded into that fact. The very instinct that once helped our species survive, find water, cool down, endure, has become, in this new climate, a source of danger in itself. Nature's oldest advice no longer fits the world nature has become. And it was not only water that turned dangerous, it was the infrastructure built to serve a temperate country. Roads buckled, rail lines, engineered to expand only within the narrow tolerances of a mild climate, were forced to impose speed restrictions to prevent the steel from warping. A hovercraft off the coast of Southsea began smoking mid-crossing, its engines unable to cope with the heat. 31 passengers evacuated into a summer sea that, for once, felt like a place of safety rather than risk. Over 1,000 schools across England and Wales sent children home early, their buildings, designed to retain warmth through damp winters, turning into greenhouses under a relentless sun. In parts of Devon, the strain on the electricity network caused hundreds of homes to lose power entirely. Air conditioning units, rare in British homes to begin with, drawing more from the grid than it had ever been asked to give. Every one of these failures tells the same underlying story. England built itself brick by brick, decade by decade, around an assumption of mildness. And the climate that made that assumption reasonable no longer exists. But here is where the story bends, unexpectedly, towards something more complicated than simple catastrophe. Because heat, as brutal as it is not the only signature of a changing England. Ecologists walking the parched fields of Dartmoor this summer have watched something else unfold alongside the crisis. A strange, uneasy kind of adaptation unfolding in real time, faster than textbooks say it should. Species that once existed only at the very southern edge of Britain, certain dragonflies, certain moths, certain spiders that shouldn't by any reasonable expectation be found north of the Mediterranean, are turning up in Cornwall, in Kent, in gardens outside London where they had never been recorded before. The wasp spider, the small red-eyed damselfly, creatures whose entire range was defined by an isotherm, an invisible line of temperature that has itself begun to march northward across the map. Is this resilience, or is it simply displacement, life fleeing one collapsing niche for another, temporary one, with no guarantee the new niche will hold? Perhaps it is both. Perhaps those are not opposites at all. Nature does not experience morality in its migrations. It does not know that the wasp spider spinning its web in a Kentish hedgerow is in some sense a messenger. A small silk-spinning proof that the boundaries drawn by centuries of British natural history are dissolving in real time. There is a version of this story that ends in despair, and it would not be dishonest to tell it that way. The soil beneath English wheat fields cracked into a mosaic of dry plates, reservoirs dropping to levels not seen in living memory, forcing hosepipe bans across counties that once complained, only half-jokingly, of too much rain. A landscape whose entire cultural identity, the soft green fields, the ever-present possibility of drizzle, the gentle unpredictability of typical British weather, being rewritten by a jet stream that has forgotten how to hold its shape. But there is another version, quieter, harder to see unless you are looking for it. It is the version written by the scientists who study soil moisture and root depth, who are already testing drought-resistant crop varieties in trial fields across Norfolk and Suffolk, adapting centuries of English agriculture to a climate their great-grandparents would not have recognized. It is written by hydrologists redesigning reservoir management for a country that must now store water not for scarcity in winter, but for scarcity in summer, a total inversion of a system built 200 years ago. It is written, too, in something as small as a change in how councils choose street trees, moving away from species that cannot survive a 40-degree pavement toward Mediterranean and Middle Eastern varieties whose roots know instinctively how to find water that isn't there. England is not disappearing. England is translating itself awkwardly and often painfully into a new dialect of climate it never expected to have to speak. And that, perhaps, is the deeper question sitting beneath all of this. Beneath the cracked tarmac and the red alerts and the strange new dragonflies drifting over gardens that used to be too cold for them. Not simply, how hot will it get, but something closer to, what does a place become when the conditions that made it recognizable begin to change beneath it? Is England still England when its rain becomes rare and its heat becomes ordinary? Or is identity, for a country, for an ecosystem, for a species, something that was always more fluid than we like to believe, something that survives not by staying the same, but by continuing to answer, generation after generation, to whatever conditions the sky decides to offer? There is a stillness that settles over a heatwave landscape in the late afternoon, when even the birds go quiet and the light turns thick and amber, and the whole world seems to be holding its breath. Stand in a field outside London at that hour, and you can almost feel the old England and the new one occupying the same space at once, the memory of soft grey rain layered invisibly over ground that has forgotten what rain feels like. Maybe that is the only honest way to end this, not with an answer, but with the silence of that field, and the quiet, unresolved question it leaves behind, whether what we are watching is an ending, or simply the slow, disorienting sound of a very old country learning to speak an entirely new language of weather. One word, one degree, one summer at a time.